Welcome everybody who's joining us. We're going to give anybody else who wants to join a bit of time, but please feel free to keep your microphones and videos off so that the video thing works well for us. And we'll be sharing this recording, but also please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat so that we know who is in the room. And I promise we will get to you throughout the conversation with Dana and Rupert, and give you a chance to ask questions or comments that we can respond to. I see familiar names to the consortium. Lucia, Lucy, welcome. It's nice to see you. Sarah, thank you for joining us. Hi, Sarah, how are you?
Very well, Enrique. How are you? How is everyone else?
Good, yeah, well. We'll give it another couple of minutes and then we will start. Hi, Lucia. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat. I'm just going to share the message again. For those who have just joined us, we're going to start in a second, and we'll start this part of the conversation with just Dana and Rupert and myself on video. So Zoom records us three. But then later on, as we welcome people to ask questions, we are a small group. We'll be happy to see you. So I'll let you know when we're ready. And in the meantime, please feel free to use yourselves in the chat. I see Lucy has done that. Lucia has done that. That would be great. So we know who's in the room. And I'm going to get my notes ready, and then we will start. Okay. Right, so welcome to this very final learning session of the African Education Research Funding Consortium. My name is Enrique Mendizábal. I'm the director of OTT, of Think Tanks, and I am joined by two members of the consortium, Dana Schmidt from Echidna Giving and Rupert Corbishley from Aga Khan Foundation. Dana was one of the founder of the consortium, and so I am sure we'll have a lot to hear from her. Welcome both.
Thanks, Enrique. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So let's first set the scene a little bit. For anybody that is not familiar, the AERFC, it's a bit of a mouthful, has brought together about 12 funders and which are mobilizing over $370 million in education research funding in Africa. And they have studied and advocated 5 key recommendations that emerge from a forum that we helped organize now almost 4 years ago, with African education researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And the 5 recommendations they came up with, two funders, where I think you will find them very logical and that make a lot of sense. So they were recommending that funding should be driven by a long-term vision, that it should be supporting African organizations directly as well as their needs, that funding should be supporting not just research, but also research communication and the use of evidence, and that it should be deliberately trying to support the inclusion of women and other disadvantaged groups in education research. And finally, a 5th recommendation, of course, is that funders should try to learn from what they're doing and not just assume these are objectives that will be met. And so dynamic learning was the fifth recommendation. So over the last 3 years, the members have shared their challenges and opportunities. They've learned from each other, and they have worked together to deliver collective action along these recommendations. And I think a testament of that is that as this consortium closes, there's a new initiative called Hairy Africa that is sort of opening the door into putting into practice some of the reflections that took place in the consortium. So why does this conversation matter today to funders? Partly because we are maybe at an inflection point between the diagnosis and the conversation that we've had over the years and action. Because maybe despite good intentions and significant investments, there's still some major systemic challenges to be addressed. We have been hearing about localization for a long time. We have been hearing about giving researchers, local researchers, power over the agenda, power over the tools, power over what they do with the information and knowledge they have. But getting that done is proving to be much harder. And finally, it matters because, as I said, there is a window of opportunity for replicability or scalability, for example, in initiatives such as Hairy Africa. So just to set the scene for this conversation, we carried out a quick review of what the consortium has done over the last 3 years. And I'm not going to go through the report. It will be ready to share with everybody in this call and then anybody watching the video later on. But some key findings that are worth sharing to start the conversation. I think one of the first things I would highlight is that funding practices are not neutral. They are decisive force that either sustains or stifles the African research ecosystem. They decide what gets studied, they decide who studies it, and they decide what issues might be addressed in public policy. We also seem to be suffering from a critical impact gap due to how resources are allocated. Our report, and I think many of the conversations have exposed a much heavier preoccupation with the production of research and the generation of data than on the communication of that research and the impact that has on public policy. We also found that I think this is important, of course, is that meaningful funder collaboration doesn't require everybody to pull their money together. And it's perfectly possible for funders to engage with each other as peers, to exchange, to share intelligence, test assumptions together, compare risks, and act in parallel to reduce duplication or even to create more opportunities for researchers in any sector, not just in education. And finally, the true systems change requires patient capital or long-term commitment. It isn't something that is going to be done in a few months, certainly not in a few years. And in the context of great instability in this world, I think this is a finding that is very important. So anyway, that's a very brief introduction. I want to get straight to talking to our guests today, to Dana and to Rupert. And I'm going to start with Dana, who was there at the beginning, and I'm going to ask her what motivated the formation of the consortium and what were your initial ambitions and expectations?
Thanks, Enrique. So I suppose appropriately for a group that's focused on research and evidence, the motivation behind the consortium was really evidence from our own portfolio at Echidna Giving. We each year sort of do a portfolio review and we look at where our funding is going. And one of the cuts of the data that we look at is how much of our funding is going to organizations who are really sort of based in the countries in which they work and led by leaders from those countries. And we were also sort of slicing our data, looking at how much of our funding was going to organizations doing primarily implementation work, primarily research work, primarily advocacy work. And when we did those data cuts, what we found was that although most of our grantees that were implementing organizations, running programs, were based in the countries in which they were working, when it came to the portfolio of organizations who were mostly doing research, it was the exact opposite. And yet, we believe that having researchers who are proximate to their work is really important for many reasons, right? Those researchers are really well positioned to determine which questions are the most important questions to answer in that context. They're also really well positioned to engage with and to influence policymakers in their context, practitioners in their context. They're in it for the long haul, right? They have long-term incentives to figure out how to make things work in their context. And so we really thought, okay, this is something we want to tackle. We don't want to, we want to see when we do our portfolio review that we have a different mix in our research portfolio. And so as we started thinking about this, we also thought, well, if we want to change the nature of our own portfolio for all of the reasons you mentioned around the necessity of sort of long-term funding and support and that allow institutions to grow and thrive and research, really strong research to happen. We felt like this probably can't just be an echidna-giving endeavor, that this is going to require some field building, and we wanted to see which other funders were thinking about this, struggling with this, and eager to engage with us. So we started having conversations with other colleagues. And long story short, that's when we worked with Imaginable Futures, the Gates Foundation, Porticus, to engage with your team, Enrique, on think tanks to help facilitate the Forum for Education Research in, by, and for Africa. And you've already told a little bit of that story of how that brought together folks from the Africa education research community, came out with these 5 principles. And then coming from that, the hope was, okay, let's continue to engage a group of funders around how we can put those principles into practice in our funding. What does that look like? What does that take? And I think our bigger picture ambition, which you asked about, was really to say, how do we then start to see different resource flows and begin to disrupt what we saw as sort of a vicious cycle, right? That like historically, Global North institutions have been funded for research. They can hire researchers and do the research, so then they're seen as the strong institutions to fund. And how could we sort of interrupt that and create more of a virtuous cycle where we began funding strong institutions in Africa. They were the ones hiring and building those institutions with strong researchers, and that's where the funding flows. So that's a little bit of the background
and the motivation. Thank you. And I'll get back to you on the bit of the outcome and the journey from that initial assessment that you just mentioned, Dana. But Rupert, how do you arrive at this consortium? What is your motivation? What is the motivation of the Aga Khan Foundation to join and to participate?
Yeah, hopes if I come off mute. Sorry. Yes. No, good question. I think as the Aga Khan Foundation, we take long-term investments into the communities and countries we live and work in. And a lot of these countries are not from the global north, as Dana says. And it made a logical step into thinking about what the role of research is within this and how we can diversify those who are contributing, those who are thinking about the questions, but the methodologies as well around how do we research these questions and start to think about the way in which research from Africa is contributing to a global conversation about what does quality look like, what do we need to do in order to create education systems and learning that is inclusive for all. Important to note also that as part of our network, we do have, universities that are located within, the Aga Khan University is based out of Karachi, Pakistan, has campus in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. We also have the University of Central Asia. And, as a network, we make investments into supporting the evolution of tertiary education writ large, and that investment into the research capabilities and the investment into doing research, for want of a better expression, sort of globally. So I think that these things came together, and understanding, the motivation that Dana expressed earlier, it seemed like a consortium that was a good fit for the Ecocon Foundation.
So now moving into the practice of the consortium, where do you think, Dana, starting with you, Dana, where do you think the collective learning that the consortium was trying to provide added value beyond what individual funders could do? I don't know if there are any examples you can offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Three concrete examples come to mind. So I think the first is that we were really able to pull knowledge from across experiences of funders in the network, and also from beyond the network, through the support of your team, Enrique, on think tanks, to really kind of create some public goods that would both help inform our own practice and help inform the practice of others. So just one example of that. There are many that folks can find, and I'm sure someone will probably at some point in the chat put in the link to the where these resources are housed. But the On Think Tanks team pulled together a review of what are mentorship models in research that might work, and that have been tried, particularly in Africa. And that's something that we found really useful as a resource for some of our grantees and sharing with others in the field. So this idea that we could say, in enacting some of these principles, particularly the one to work with researchers who are at communities who are typically left out of research, how can we cull from our experiences and put together resources to help us all do this work better? So that's one example. Second, there were many of us in the group who had shared grantees. Not everyone with any one grantee, but subsets of us with different grantees. And this consortium provided a space for us to think together about how we could best support those organizations to align with the principles coming out of the forum. And just having the ability to bring multiple perspectives into those brainstorms around this, and having the ability to come up with some things that maybe we had common voice and shared vision for in engaging with those organizations made it more salient and more powerful. And so I think that was a second sort of domain in which this collective work really helped us. And then the last piece was it allowed us to come together around some new things we might fund. So, I talked about the forum, and I talked about the launch of this consortium. Sort of in parallel, we didn't want the forum to just be, here are the principles, and and then the funders are going to go off behind closed doors and talk about them, and that's it. So we worked with education, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Enhancing Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, ESSA, and Southern Hemisphere. They launched a parallel process to really continue to engage that ecosystem of folks in African education research in actually dreaming about what they could do to create new mechanisms for really enhancing education research in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so that was, a space for them to give permission to dream big about what does it take to build this ecosystem. And that was sort of the predecessor of the work you mentioned at the outset, Enrique, around harnessing education research for impact in Africa, or HARI Africa, which recently launched, we can share more about. But I think, again, this is not everyone who's kind of jumped on board. That doesn't fit for every funder, but it has been a space where we could talk about, okay, what are some new solutions that we might come together and come behind and fund? So those are the three examples that come to mind for me.
Thank you, Dana. What about you, Bert? What do you think being the kind of the added value that joining the consortium has offered?
Yeah, I mean, just would sort of agree with everything said. I think one of the great things about this consortium, and it is raised in the report, is providing space for trusted, open, honest conversations. And this is an area where these conversations need to happen. And I think that enabled that knowledge mobilization that Dana was talking about, that ability to be able to share that knowledge in that open space. And I think, right at the end of the report, it talks about the importance of having that third party facilitator in OTT to hold that space for the providers. And I think that has been a really powerful a powerful space to engage diverse perspectives in a way that is coming around a common vision, a common 5 recommendations, a common agenda to try and enable us to move forward as a collective around a collective vision and how that might look. And for me, I think that is it is quite unique. We do have a lot of these communities of learning and collective spaces and all the rest of it. But I have found that this has been a space which has held that trust and that openness to create that honesty and that reflection. So for me, that is one of the sort of the driving thing that has enabled the impact that Dana has spoken to earlier.
So thank you. But let me ask about impact then, Dana. You started by telling us what you found in your portfolio review before the consortium, and actually during the lifetime of this initiative, we did review the portfolios of the members, a sample of the members, and we found. I mean, I quote these numbers often, right? So we found that looking at the whole portfolio, a sample of the whole portfolio of members, we found that more or less 50% of the grants were going to African-based organizations, right? So this is of all the grants that the members were giving out on education research in Africa or about Africa, 50% of those grants were being given to African organizations. But about 85% of the grant dollars were going to US-based organizations. And I think this resonated across the board. Not everybody was in that situation, of course. So I guess that's more or less what you were describing in your introduction. How has that shifted since in the last 3 years?
When I gave that example, I was thinking, oh, I should have pulled numbers so I had them at my fingertips. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I think for us, it has shifted quite significantly. That we have both new African research institutions in our portfolio and have made bigger bets in those institutions and given larger grants. So I think we have over the last handful of years seen a shift in that direction for sure. And I wish I had pulled the number so I could give you those specifics. And I also think, we have the benefit at Echidna Giving of having a growing portfolio. So I think it's been easier for us to make that shift than it might be for other funders for whom, it's about how do you find space within a fixed budget to do that. But I think we have seen a significant shift in our own portfolio.
So you're describing there a bit of an enabler, right? So the funder's own situation where you're expanding your portfolio, so you have room to decide where the next new grants are going to go to proximate organizations or local organizations, and also a barrier where some funders have a limited portfolio. They are making grants within the existing portfolio. What other factors, Rupert, maybe we can start with you. What other factors do you think explain the difficulty in changing some funding practices that would more closely align with those 5 principles that the consortium was advocating for?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really came out, and just to double down on your point, I think one of the things that really emerged at the beginning was making the invisible visible. I think people were aware of these figures and numbers, but when it becomes 50%, 85%, it becomes very concrete, and it becomes something that has really brought a vision, brought the collective vision. but even within that, I think the report does, and I think our experience is that there are these organizational, institutional challenges that exist, as Dana sort of referred to. One of the things I've been looking into recently, I go down rabbit holes and things like this, um, but is looking at entropy and the way in which, it takes sustained effort to actually stop these things from decaying. And when I was reading the report, I was looking at it through this lens and thinking about how it raised a couple of times, that there was this challenge that people were raising through the reflection that it was hard to get people time within the organization to commit to this, to the onward into the organization. That when meetings were postponed and things, it was because there was a clash of these sort of scheduling and things like this. And right at the end, one of the great things that worked was this sharing of learning, which we've discussed. But what didn't work, or not so well in brackets, was that movement from learning to action. And I think, in certain instances, there's a lot of money and energy put into maintaining the status quo. And as Dana sort of said right at the beginning, this was around disruption, and disruption takes effort, energy, and financing. And I think that has been a challenge, and that has been a challenge to overcome. That said, I think the emergence of Hairy Africa is a phenomenal, success of what has happened here, and the consortium. But I think within this, we're individuals within organizations with differing levels of influence, control, and all the rest of it. And I think that is something that kind of entropy, that continuation in that external system that maintains the status quo. These sorts of things have been, as using your word, Enrique, barriers to sometimes realizing that collective vision at an action level.
Dana, please go ahead. What do you think are some of those
Yeah, just
some of those
gonna jump
barriers?
in. I think those are all great points. I think another sort of thing that ends up maintaining the status quo is the perceptions of risk among funders. Where do we perceive risk, right? And funding institutions that maybe do not have the same length of track record or things that the institutions that we funded all along have had. And I think you can also flip that on its head, right? And say, where is there greater risk in terms of impact, or who's more likely to have an impact, and how do you think differently about different dimensions of risk, I suppose. So I think that's one factor. I think if I think about the first principle coming out of the forum of supporting a long-term vision, I think a huge barrier there is that funders themselves often have very short-term strategies, right? Like so many funders are revising strategies every 3 years, which, if you're a funder, that's like a nanosecond, I think, in the life scale of actually funding work. And so I think that's a huge barrier. And then I think given budgets and often you're making 3-year commitments or things to organizations, there's not a lot of room to move quickly to change portfolios for many funders. So I think that's a real constraint as well.
We spent a lot of time in the consortium talking about the second recommendation, the second principle, which was about supporting local organizations and crucially supporting local agendas. And I wonder, Dana or Rupert, if you have something to say about the difficulty in doing this. I think it's easier said than done, right? To say, yeah, we will support local agenda, but then how do we do that without in some way interfering after all the money's coming from outside, right? And I should say that I think most of the members of the consortium were foreign funders. There are a couple of local foundations, but by and large, the bigger part of the consortium was international funders. So why is supporting local agendas harder done than said, or easier said than done? Sorry.
I mean, because we all do have our own agendas, right? Like,
Right.
I don't know a single funder who doesn't have some sort of thing that they're trying to achieve, right? Impact
Yeah.
they want to achieve in the world, and that does not always 100% line up with local agendas, right? And so I think it is much easier said than done, and different decision bodies at funders will be able to flex in different ways to respond to those local agendas. I mean, I think in our case, the Kidney Giving is very focused on girls' education and thinks about gender equity in education. So we do look for that gender lens in the work that we fund, but hope that that can be sort of embedded within any number of spaces within education research. But I don't think we can escape the fact or pretend like we don't have some sort of agenda ourselves as funders. And so that does sometimes clash.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very honest and refreshing answer, because often the language is a bit cagey. No, we're letting you decide. But you're right. Every funder has an agenda, just like any research organization or any think tank or government has its own. Rupert, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it also comes into this idea of control. And like we talk about this idea of control on many levels, when people start saying, well, what would it mean to go to scale? And a lot of the hardship that people have is they've got to let go. They've got to let go of certain things. I mean, internally, we're looking, we look at monitoring evaluation agenda as well as research agenda. And one of the things I'm trying to support people to think through is how we might take a more citizen science approach. Another example, I know Harry is set up in Kenya. Another example from Kenya is Curious. Shuja suddenly realized that they had this enormous network of motivated young people, and they can activate this network to run massive citizen science processes across Kenya. And we were really interested around this and starting to think through how this might work. And that is there's a lot of trust in there around data quality and all the rest of it. There's a lot of these other things. But it's also a way that we can start to crowdsource, well, what should we be asking? What's important? And these sorts of areas, so that we can start to triangulate how we start to allocate research financing towards actually addressing the questions that people are most interested in within diverse geographies and areas that we are. So this is a way that we can start to co-create the agenda. And I think sometimes we can be a little bit, what do you mean, polarizing or binary or whatever within these conversations around global and local and things like this. Why is a local agenda not part of a global agenda and things like this? And we start to lose these conversations. And so, yeah, I think one of the things around this is how do we support an agenda and support local, diverse voices start to influence and direct that agenda. But in that, I think it goes back to, Dana, your point around risk, and it goes back into that idea of control, which I think is brought out very well in the report when it talks about the power dynamics and the way that financing is not neutral.
I do think this point about control is really important, right? Because to me, that's the distinction. Yes, of course, every funder will have their agenda. I think the way you kind of get around this by still kind of aligning with the principle of responding to local needs, agendas, and initiatives is you find the place where your agenda overlaps with those local needs, agendas, and initiatives, and you support it without sort of trying to over control it or push it in a direction that is not aligned with what is viewed from that on the ground perspective. And I think there's a lot that happens that is a little bit more controlling than that, a little bit more pushing people in a direction that isn't aligned with what is perceived from that vantage point.
Thank you. I'm gonna go off script a little bit, because of course we started this 3, 4 years ago. The world was very different. All right, I think we were still talking about multilateralism, cooperation. Cooperation was not a bad word. Even within the field of education, gender was mainstream. We would, it was a condition for most part. A lot of things have changed, right? The kinds of projects are probably getting more support. The way organizations are engaging or speaking to each other. Do you think the changing context is affecting these principles or the possibility of sort of faster movement in this direction, and how?
I think the sort of salience of government ownership is stronger than ever, right? I think
Right.
maybe there was a time when this hope that you could fund something great and a multilateral or bilateral funder could then fund it and take it up. Like that is no longer, I mean, I think it was probably there were probably always questions about that as a strategy, but like now really the end game is if we want solutions at scale for education, you can't leave governments out of that equation. And so the question of, this need to respond to local needs and agendas, and, provide funding and research that kind of can actually feed into government systems, I think is more salient now than it was before. That would be my perspective, that is perhaps an opportunity. I mean, I think certainly there are also there's parts of the funding, parts of the research infrastructure like DHS and other things that were valuable tools and resources that are now at risk as a result of this. So I think there's also some losses in the mix, but some opportunities to and incentives, I suppose, to align with these principles.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that that idea of opportunity as well. I think, we know that there has been capital flight out of the social development sector globally, and that education has been hit quite hard. One of the things that, over the past year, across different communities and networks within Kenya particularly, but across the region, is the way that people have been positing, starting to think differently, and starting to say, well, this is our opportunity to start to take leadership, and it's our agenda. We must invest in this agenda. I mean, Impact Philanthropy Africa ran a sort of research around domestic philanthropy and realized there was somewhere in the region of, and take with a slight pinch of salt, I think, but $1.5 billion annually raised in domestic philanthropy in Kenya. That's a significant amount of resources. So, I think that's where the positives lie and the opportunities lie within this. And I think, how might we sort of think through that? And I love this idea that, this long-term vision that is articulated within HERI. We want to raise $100 million by 2050. Well, what a brilliant timeline to think about, thinking, Dana, about the short-term strategies you were talking about. Well, that's a long-term financing strategy. The fact that they want to go from 3 to 50% is a recognition of that change within the financing landscape, and where money, should be coming from for social development, and where we want to see that. I know this is particular around research, but more generally. So, I agree. I think I just wanted to leap on that opportunity, because sometimes, we do sort of look at the whole narrative, and recognizing the deep cuts that have been made, and the deep hurt and the ethics around that have occurred because that, sometimes we forget the opportunities that Dana spoke to.
I think you're right. I think not to be too off topic, but the sense we get at on think tanks, or speaking to think tanks, many of them working in the education sector, of course, across the world, is that in regions that were heavily dependent on international cooperation and that feel that international cooperation has left or is going to leave, there's almost a sense of, well, let's turn the page. We do have the resources. We just need to mobilize them and use them in the best possible way. It has to be our responsibility, right? And I think that conversation suggests that there is an opportunity, as you were saying, Dana, that the lessons learned from these efforts do not need to be scaled with foreign funding alone, but actually could be scaled with domestic resources. And so I'm gonna ask you one more question, but I just want to signal to those in the room that I'll be very happy to welcome you to join the discussion. So if you want to ask a question in the chat, please do so, or you want to add a comment in the chat, please do so, or just let me know and I'll let you in one by one to continue the discussion. But looking into the future, what do you think are the most interesting, important, or relevant elements that emerge in the consortium that could be replicated, scaled, or simply used to inform future decisions? Why don't we start with you, Rupert, in terms of what are the lessons, what are the findings, what are the resources, what are the connections maybe that emerged in this experience that will be useful in the future?
Yeah, and I think leaping on a word you used just in there, just the connections. I think the importance of relationships. And I think that's what, was part of creating that safe space I spoke to right at the start, was this importance of the relationships. I think moving forward, maybe how might those relationships go beyond people and really become institutional relationships? And I use that word purposefully because I think, and a lot of times, once the institution gets involved, it becomes a partnership, and then it becomes bureaucratic and these sorts of things, right? So how are they becoming institutional relationships? And I'm sure we've all been in a situation where a person exits the organization, either in an organization you've been working with or in this, and kind of the relationship just disappears. And you suddenly realize that it was a personal relationship and not an institutional one. And I think that's a really something that really did work. And I think one of the things that's come out, is this idea of long term, and we've talked about the long term strategy, 20, 50, $100 million, which is wonderful. I like to think in a futurist kind of way and apply that to strategy and things. And I think that 2050 timeline gives a really good, what is the systems evolution we want to see by that point? And therefore, what's the vision and strategy and tactics that we'll use in order to try and get to that position? And I really feel that, this idea of the democratization of research, and really thinking about who are involved in setting the agenda. How is citizen science coming into this? I accuse people internally a lot. We mine information a lot of times. And what the report raises is that we should be making a conscious effort into the communication of that. And I really feel that a lot of times within the communications, beyond a dissemination event at some place, we don't think about broad dissemination into communities and things like this. And I think, how does this link into a broader democratization of research through the leadership of African research institutions that are grounded in the broader process across diverse, often marginalized and subjugated epistemologies, even methodologies. I think we talked about it, was it last year or the year before, at the Transforming Education Network conference in South Africa, like this methodological imperialism and things like this. So, that's really something where I think that long term and really getting into that idea of African leadership and the democratization of research and all of those aspects of research that is required.
Yeah, it's interesting. It brings me back to the forum where many participants spoke about the fact that we shouldn't just limit ourselves to thinking of research or knowledge generation at the university or the think tank level, but consider teachers, administrators, educators, students as capable of generating useful evidence and useful knowledge. Dana, what do you think might be some of those elements of not just the consortium, but the lessons learned, the experience, the efforts made by the funders that can be taken into the future?
So I think the first, maybe most obvious thing that comes to mind is I think these five principles that came out of the forum that really drove the consortium, like all of those remain incredibly relevant. And I would say relevant not only to research funding, but probably even more broadly, these ideas around supporting a long-term vision, responding to local needs and agendas, providing funding. This one more specific to research, but providing funding across generation, communication, and use of evidence. I think Rupert spoke to that, and I still carry one of the sort of things that came up during the forum that I think about all the time is that evidence use, it should be part of how we define whether evidence is high quality or not, right? And so, yeah, absolutely, like getting down into the teachers who are doing the research, they're going to use that in the classroom, right? So as we think about not quality, not only in terms of methodology, but also in terms of whether or not the evidence gets used. And then the other two principles, right, around supporting the inclusion of marginalized groups in education, research, and dynamic learning. Those are all things that I think we can take forward in our research funding, and some of them in our funding practices more broadly. There's also tons of resources, some of which I alluded to before, that I think can carry forward. And then I think lastly, sort of this central set of insights that we gathered together about our own funding practices, like challenging ourselves to continue tracking some of the same data points in our own portfolios. And I guess just borrowing language that Rupert used, continue the disruption. And so I think that's another thing to carry forward. And for us, as I said, I think we will continue to look for that in our portfolio. And we're excited to continue advancing this through the work of HARI Africa that we've already spoken a little bit about. I think what's exciting about it is, bringing together government actors, civil society actors, universities under sort of shared leadership. And I think partly as a result of the fact that it's anchored with government, they've already attracted funding from the National Research Fund in Kenya. They've attracted private sector funding. So I think capitalizing on this opportunity to really be embedded in and responding to agendas that matter in Kenya, and then also thinking more regionally. So I'll put the website for HARI Africa in the chat as well for folks who might be interested in learning a little bit more about that. But I think it is for us an exciting avenue to continue to advance and disrupt in a positive way.
And we will share the link to all the resources shared in the description below in the video. I want to invite anybody who would like to ask a question or add a comment, just raise your hand and I'll patch you in. But I also want to make a plea, because I think one of the things that I wasn't too surprised, but I thought it'd be easier, was to keep track of some of the data. So I think that's probably a call you mentioned, Dana, is to, I think funders can make a big difference by making it easier for themselves also to access data on some of these recommendations, right? So that their databases, each grant has length of time, the number of times maybe a grantee has received funding in the past, the whether the grantee was responding to a call for proposals, or whether they were submitting a proactive call for funding. Who's getting the money, whether there's subcontracting or subgranting or regranting happening in there. All bits of information that would make tracking progress a lot easier, not just individually, but across funders. So we're almost out of time, and I just want to make sure that anybody who has a question will be able to ask it directly, or make a comment directly to you, Dana, and Rupert. But as a way of also of closing the session, I wanted to hear a little bit more about Hairy Africa. Dana, I don't know if you can, or you, Rupert, you can tell us a little bit of a preview of what we can see if we visit the Hairy Africa website, and what we can expect to see coming forward, because the consortium is coming to an end. We will make sure that all the resources developed and shared will still live on the web, so they should be accessible. But I think the next step is to put some of these things into action, and Hairy Africa is one of those mechanisms.
I'm hoping, if she's willing and still here, Sarah Ruto
Yes,
could
Sarah.
come in and share a little. I think she's going to be the most compelling voice on this. She's worked very hard to make it a reality, so I want her to be able to speak to it directly. Sarah?
Yes, certainly, Dana.
Sorry, can you, I will turn on your video so that you can join us.
All right, and I hope
Great, we
everyone
can see you.
hear me.
Welcome, Sarah. Nice to see you again. Yes, please tell us
Thank you.
about Hairy Africa, and that's a nice way of closing the event with the future of these conversations.
So, Harry, let me begin with the name, because perhaps that's the most important thing. It's harnessing educational research for impact in Africa. But in Kiswahili, it also has a meaning. It can mean blessing, it can mean now. So it has become a very good way to have conversation of why it is important that we think differently about evidence. The tagline that Harry has adopted is investing in locally led solutions and the African researchers who drive them. And I say it because it has a direct link to the principles that were developed, designed 3 years ago. And as Harry begins to expand to the other countries, I imagine that those principles that were formed 3 years ago will continue guiding it, have continued to guide it now, and will continue to guide it in future. I'm also happy that we have a number of Hairy people here who are associated with Hairy, or their institutions are associated with Hairy in one way or another. But just very quickly, in 2 minutes, Hairy has decided to be big in its dreams. And one of that meant that when the ESSER and Southern Hemispheres held a meeting to move from theory and the 8 ideas they had identified into practice, the group that received these ideas were leaders in their own rights, who were heading institutions, both government, state and non-state, and also universities. And I think having these leaders was very important, because what has happened is that the people who stepped forward, and I think there were about 7 or 8 institutions, are today the people who are driving Hairy, starting it off. So you have 2 universities, 3 or 4 government institutions, another 3 or 4 non-state. And I think that's really exciting, having this collaboration across. All the people are united by the fact that they're interested in evidence, in research, and in an institutionalized way of thinking about it. I will finish by saying that even though it is new, I think there are some important milestones that they have met. Of the 8 ideas that Lucy led, were they 8? I think there were 8. The team decided that 2 were the most critical. To start with, agreeing on a research agenda that is driven by the country to meet the research needs of the country. And the second, because it offered structure, was to institutionalize the research chairs. And I think they have already come up with the research agenda, which I have heard it being presented in a number of places. It's seen as a living document. but already those research areas have been identified, owned by the system. The second is that 3 research chairs have already started. And Professor Siriaka here in the meeting is the coordinator of the research chairs. And I know that very recently they launched, HERI has been launched in Kenya, but very recently the research chair on math education on the day of math decided to actually institutionalize both the chair in University of Embu, but also the partnerships. So you have a neighboring school, public school, Kangaroo DB, that is now hosting the math lab. That will be the place and space for children, teachers, everybody to come and think about math education. Because HERI is about impact. It's not just about research. I could go on and on and on about the exciting partnerships that they have gotten, about the fact that the governance is government-led. So the 2 co-chairs are the principal secretaries for research and the principal secretary for education. I was in the steering committee where these leaders were discussing, and that will be my last point, that when government is in leadership and in decision-making, then what it does is that it also unlocks money that the treasury has, that these countries, developing countries, have money. We need to find a way to unlock it to support the work. And we have seen in these discussions that thinking and talking about something in just a different way allows partnerships that last to be formed and to continue. Because I think the best way to sustain a process is through ensuring that you get national funding from the treasury. And HERI is on the right path to do that. Thank you, and back to you, Dana, and everyone else.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think a point you made there is that also when you have a conversation at the local level, new actors show up. Like it's easier to see who else has a role to play. And as you said, in this case, in unlocking the resources that are necessary for these initiatives. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing this with us. I think this is a very nice way of closing this chapter by properly introducing the next chapter. We're happy to have played a small role in doing so, and we hope we can continue to engage and also document that experience. I am particularly interested in what the chairs can deliver, because I think it's an excellent approach to what we want to achieve. It's long term, it's locally led, it can certainly connect research with practice, and it can create the opportunities for disadvantaged groups to participate in research in ways that maybe other mechanisms don't. This is all the time we have, but I want to thank Rupert for joining this conversation and for being an active participant of the consortium. Dana, I want to thank you and also the other founders of the forum, and then the sort of active members of the consortium, but certainly you and your team, you've been the champions right from the beginning.
And thank you, of course. The On Think Tanks team has done just a fabulous job pulling us together and generating a lot of resources that I hope can be used for years to come. So thanks for all of that. It's been awesome.
Yeah, and thank you. And I've definitely learned more than I've been able to provide, and that's always a sign of a consortium and a relationship that works. I think when we all get more than we are feasibly able to put in.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It has been a really interesting experience, and we will, our commitment is to continue to contribute to the body of knowledge that has been generated already. And so, if anybody in this call or listening to this, watching this video later on, would like to know more about what the consortium did and the forum, what it generated, and where to find those resources, we'll always be happy to reply and to respond. And as I said, in the description below, we will add some of the links from me and from the rest of the OTT team, Pusayumi, Rachel, and Joy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.